Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second BBI Judgment webinar series. My name is Joe Kubuthi. This webinar series is in partnership with the Elephant and Heritage Wealth Foundation that seeks to explain, to understand the implications of the June 2nd BBI judgment in the context of what's happening in the country, but in this is particular, the context of the youth and the inclusivity question. Today, I'm joined by 4 panelists who will be discussing with me what the BBI judgment means for the youth and what it means for the country moving forward. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce to my nearest right, Dr. Ngala Chome. Dr. Ngala Chome is a historian, a writer, recently finished his PhD, understanding the history of the coast. He's been involved mainly in research around terrorism, violent extremism in the coast and marginalized areas around the coast. Karibu Chome.
Thank you.
Secondly, I'd like to introduce Lorraine Wesonga. Lorraine Wesonga is a Chevening scholar. She's a researcher, an academic, a writer whose main research interests involve mainly around governance within the context of the post-colonial state. Thirdly is Darius Okola. Darius Okola is an economist, a writer, a researcher, currently the audiovisual curator at the Elephant. And lastly, but not least, is Shiko Kihika. Ms. Shiko Kihika is the executive director of Tribeless Youth, an organization that tries to foster a new kind of politics within the youth bracket of Kenya. She's an activist, a social commentator, among many other things. Karibuni nyote to this webinar.
Asante. Thank you.
Asanteni. I just want to start with Shiko. Just if you may, I mean, on June 2nd, we had the High Court ruling. Later on a ruling of the BBI judgment, calling it null, void, and unconstitutional. For someone who works particularly with the urban youth, urban and marginalized areas, the urban poor, what are some of your immediate reflections and what this means for them?
For me, I think this meant there's hope. It meant that not every single arm of the government has been gagged by the government itself. So just seeing that come out, it meant that for a common person, there is hope. What we saw over and over again were threats, threats from the government, threats from those people who were in dire need for this document to actually go through for whatever reasons. But then coming out and seeing how these judges expounded and confidently put out these issues and seeing how much they fought and defended the current constitution that we have, for me, this meant that all is not lost, that we might be going through a lot right now, but there is actually hope to redeem ourselves.
Over to you, Darius. What are some of the immediate reflections that you have around the BBI June 2nd judgment and what it means for this country?
Thank you. I think for me, the major issues that they raised, which is they basically said, if you're going to go through with a referendum that will change the constitution, you basically have to do issues of, civic education. You have to put in public education, public participation. You have to put in a constitutional, assembly, and then a referendum. The fact that they were affirming there's a process, there's a way to go about this journey. And most importantly, is the fact that within each of these spaces, whether it's the civic education, whether it's the public participation, whether it's the constitutional assembly, and finally even the referendum itself, there are youth, there are younger people involved in all these processes in various and different capacities, and each one of them is able to, at the very least, speak into the process of trying to change the constitution. So the fact that Judge Matheka and Odunga and Joel Ngugi and their colleagues affirmed that, basically affirmed the fact that we are not a country of, where you wake up in the morning and make a roadside declaration, or a document that is pushed in, to Kenyans via president, a presidential will, but that we are a country with processes, we are a country with systems, and all these systems are robust enough to be able to accommodate as much views as possible, including that of the younger people, and that you have to follow this process if at the very end you want a legitimate outcome. So I found that very affirming.
Thank you, Darius. And over to you, Ngala. But even as you speak about the BBI judgment, if you'd also locate this within Kenya's historical constitutional struggle and what this judgment means for that history.
Yeah, I mean, the BBI judgment was very clear that it was paying attention to the history of constitutional making and reform in Kenya. Two major historic things to take note of from the judgment, of course, is the invoking of the doctrine of basic structure, and paying attention to the history of constitutional struggle or constitutional reform in Kenya. And it is the paying attention to that process that then leads to the conclusion that for the BBI process to be termed as a popular initiative, it needed to go through these processes that Darius has just kind of enumerated, civic education, public participation. It's actually a process that would have taken about 2 to 3 years if it really followed this process that the judgment had put forth. But then again, to link our history of constitutional making in Kenya and the question and this question of the youth, I think it is also important to recognize that Kenya gained independence with a very youthful political class. Our first constitutional minister, Tom Mboya, was constitutional minister when he was in his 30s. I think he was about 33, 34 years old, and many powerful senior politicians at that time were actually youth. So I think the question as we progress in this discussion today is what happens after that, right? Why is this category of youth that we have now learned to call youth? How does it become excluded from power? How does it become excluded from decision making over the years? And why also over the years is this category of youth deemed as problematic to the prevailing political class? And I think this thinking is also written within the BBI process itself and the BBI report itself. The youth being seen as a category that either needs salvation or is actually the problem when it comes to political conflict, right? So I guess these are questions that I'm sort of hitting at now that we'll address later in the discussion.
Thanks for that, Ngala. But just to piggyback on what you've said around, how we have framed the youth in Kenya as, there is two-pronged ideas as the category of people to be saved on one hand, but on the other hand, as people who cause violence and etc. People who these rogues, rogues trotting around. And over to you, Shiko. You're looking at now the BBI report. And does it in your view, how does it frame the youth question? But then secondly, does it solve the youth question, in particular to inclusivity, and especially for the urban youth who many times feel marginalized during election, usually the face of the violence? Do you think that the BBI process and the report itself fixes this issue?
Actually, no. I think BBI is a joke, just to put it out there, because I look at what they've put there for young people, considering that this is what they claim to be the majority of the population, which is true, but also the population that is very much unemployed and very much vulnerable. And like what Ngala said, that we are that generation where they feel like this is the generation that needs help, but at the same time, they're the chaotic generation. Then you tell us the only thing you have for us is for you to help us get jobs and be stable enough is to give us 7 years tax holiday. And on top of that, you continue taxing us. And on top of that, you sort of just sit and watch as we lose more jobs. So for me, if I'm to talk like a common young person, is that BBI has nothing for me. BBI is just a political document that is meant to sustain the old guards in power, that is meant to, and I'm sorry to say if this hurts someone, but it's meant to safeguard the wealth of the thieves. So we have to sit here, and for them, youth right now is the block that will pass BBI. Because of course their normal strategy is they come and give us money, we campaign for them, we vote for them. You know,
Right.
they forget that the youth is waking up. They forget that the same youth they're talking about, you know, it's funny because the old guards right now were the youth who fought for this constitution. Now they are old enough to realize, oh, the constitution actually has a problem that we are the ones to change. Why don't they allow us now, who are benefiting from this, who will leave the same constitution to our kids, to actually sit and analyze it and say, these are the problems that we see, that we can actually go and work and try to fix them. You do not come and force an illegal process on people the way they're forcing it. And I think the bigger question we should be having, and we should have had from the beginning, is what was so important that the president and his brother Raila felt like they needed to threaten us to pass this document? What is this hidden treasure that was in this document that they could not even take time to print some copies so that they get to common people for reading? Because if we remember well, someone like Orengo, before the Constitution 2010, when the first draft was made, they are the first people who advocated to get the Gazette notice printed out and sent to people. So why is it that right now is a different conversation? Why is it that right now we don't need to read it that way? We have a link online and that should be enough. Then we are forgetting that we are still in the same quote unquote digital government, but a country that has a huge population of its people not even accessing electricity, leave alone internet. So I just think like this is a stance. It has nothing for the young people. They're just doing the same thing, blind us so that we feel like this document is pretty. You're gonna tell us you're giving us 7 years tax holiday, then you'll keep borrowing and increasing our revenues out here. So how is that logical? How are you going to make sure that the biggest task force, the labor force of this country, is going for 7 years without paying taxes? Then we cannot forget that youth is transitional. You're only a youth for less than 16 years. Then after that, what happens? So 7 years of your youthhood, you wouldn't be paying taxes. Then when you start paying taxes, what happens? So I just think it's a lie, it's a big lie. And it's a way of blending the youth as they're used to doing, to just make sure they follow and just vote for the documents.
Okay, Ngala, I mean, overall, just one of the 9-point agenda of the BBI, one of them was ending electoral violence. And for someone who has researched, comes from a marginalized part of Kenya, the coastal part, who has worked on extreme violence, extremist violence within Kenya's political landscape, but even within the religious, particularly Islam. Do you think BBI will solve this problem?
This question of marginalization, I think we need to be clear about what we mean when we talk about marginalization, in the sense that who is being marginalized, right? So, you know, so like people can talk of ethnic marginalization in this country. People can also talk of the marginalization of young people. People can also talk of the marginalization of women. People can also talk of the marginalization of religious minorities. So in this case, Muslims. So there are very different ways of like discussing and approaching the subject of marginalization. But there is one way in which in Kenyan political history we have come to understand the concept of marginalization, and we have come to associate it with, in particular, ethnic and regional marginalization, right? So in this case, they're talking about regions like northeastern Kenya, and northern Kenya much more widely, the Kenyan coast, And if you go back to the 60s, you know, even regions such as the parts of the Rift Valley and Western Kenya, you know, saw themselves as being excluded regions coming out of that colonial experience. You know, so like the division between KANU and KADU in 1961, between 1961 and 1963, you know, around this idea of Majimbo, which basically was a proposal for, you know, sort of like a quasi-federal system, whereby the Kenyan state will be properly decentralized, and power and resources will be transported or transferred from Nairobi to 8 regions, right? That will make policy around land, around employment, and around basically how to spend revenue within those regions, right? So of course we know that system did not work, or actually was not allowed to work. And by 1964, Kenya was back into a heavily centralized state controlled from Nairobi, right? And you know, Kenyan politics since then has been a struggle between political elites from these ethno regions to control that center, right? Which is why it became very unstable, especially with the reintroduction of multi-party politics in the 1990s. So it seems for me that the solution has always been to decentralize, right? How
Right.
to include regions that have felt excluded from the central system that has been dominated by a cabal of elites from particular regions of the country, was to decentralize, right? But you know that by 2007, with the post-election violence, the term Majimbo had acquired, you know, negative connotations, right? It was associated as being behind not only the post-election violence of 2007, but also all the ethnic clashes in the 1990s, 92 and 97. And so therefore, you know, that association with violence, you know, ODM, which was the party that had supported Majimbo in 2007, you know, they sort of had to move away from that concept after 2007, which is why there's a lot of detail there, but this is why we end up with devolution at the level of 47 counties and not going back to the 60s in this kind of regions, right? So that I have to say that from the coast, for example, the current system of decentralization, which is devolution at the level of 47 counties, was not received with a lot of enthusiasm on the coast. You know, people had expected you know, the coast to be a government, and if the coast was a government, then it would have much more power to decide the fate of the region, right? Including land, including resources, including employment. That these small counties, 6 counties on the coast, for example, could not play that role, or could not address the popular perceptions that people had regarding what decentralizing the state should mean, right? So already there, with the 2010 constitution, becomes very disappointing when it comes to including these regions that had felt excluded from the center. But one thing to note is that you know, in fact, on the coast, devolution was dismissed as Vijimbo, right? And Vijimbo is to say that not only were they small in size, but they're also small in function and power, right? But you know, these are the sentiments that I was collecting, you know, around 2012, 2013. You know, 10 years later, or say, well, during the last elections and after, people had seen that the counties could do something that they had not seen before.
Right.
So you know, it went from people being disappointed with devolution to the cost producing politicians by 2017 who are the best defenders of devolution. You know, talking about Hassan Joho, for example, of Mombasa, who was caught in this battle with the president, and coming out as the champion of devolution, because he comes from a region where devolution had been popular as an idea because people had felt excluded from the national central system, right? So
Right.
that, I think, then is the narrative of like, how do we involve regions that have been excluded from the center through constitutional making? Devolution was offered as the solution. Now, what does the BBI do to that kind of proposal? The only thing that I've seen in the BBI proposal is to increase revenue, right? So it has become a very economic, it has a very, like, it's a very, there's a very economic language to it, right? It's just, or increase money. And, but I think like it's deeper than that. And this also ties in with how we've looked at the question around youth. And I think we still need to also disabuse this fact that we have a monolithic category of youth. But I think also the way that we have looked at the problem of the youth is also to throw money at it, right? And to talk about, oh, they need jobs, right? But usually I think that misses the point. It's usually a question around power, and power, recognition, respect, feeling that your voice is being heard, right? These far deeper questions, I think, is what matters when it comes to not only regions that are felt excluded, but also many young people in this country.
Precisely. I mean, we'll definitely. Before I jump back to Darius to talk about this economic logic around the BBI, just to go back to you, Shiko. The last couple of years, particularly, there's been a lot of conversations around the question of women in politics, and BBI in particular has really anchored itself as trying to really convince this particular constituent of its necessity. We have seen in the document there's conversations around having 47 another 47 plus senators, just exclusive for the women. What do you make of this process, and how it has involved or not involved women as a constituent for its gains?
I find it weird that we are trying to do away with one thing, which is the women rep positions, to increase the Senate positions. And I see, like, in our normal setup, our parliament, especially now the National Assembly, has more powers than the Senate we have.
Right.
So are you not telling us indirectly that we are giving you more positions, but at the same time, we are going to cripple your voices within that statement? And it's funny how our political parties, which are very much illegally constituted, because our political parties don't even meet the 2/3 gender rule, they are going to tell us how they're going to form a government that is going to honor that. I don't think it really makes sense. And for me, it's about looking at it beyond. We have a government that says but never does. So I'm just looking at how we have a very good president who knows how good to talk to people and how to tell people what they want to hear. But when it comes to actually working, it's a matter of him sponsoring hashtags, but not really working. So this same guy is going to tell us how if we offer these slots to women, then we're going to be achieving the 2/3 gender rule. I don't think we need all that. The 2/3 gender rule can easily be achieved if our political parties honored that statement, if they were legally constituted, if they included women from the beginning. You cannot have a party where the entire leadership is masculine and then come tell us how once they get into power, they're going to make sure that we meet the 2/3 gender rule. I think it's a lie. And I think the realization that our women, and especially women in politics, have been used as puppets for the longest time. They're always the mouthpieces of their senior bosses who are masculine. So it's always weird when I find it that these women who are telling us how they're going to be included in this document, they were not even included in the process of understanding what could have made sense in formation of an all-inclusive parliament or government. So for me, I don't think it really makes sense. And I feel like this is how, the same way Nkala has put it in a very diplomatic manner. I'm not that diplomatic, but the same way he's done it, I'll just say, in one word, this thing is a scam. So we beautify it with words, we do all these things, but it's not meant to actually do what it needs to do.
Thanks for that. Darius, over to you. I mean, there's this part of the whole process of BBI was a conversation around baking a bigger cake. And part of that conversation was, as Ngala has mentioned, increasing revenues to the counties, right? And from 15% to 35%. And with that came the conversations around youth commission, 7-year tax relief. But as an economist, if you kindly contextualize what BBI, one, it means its implementation means for the cost of the economy, but even two, just where do we find ourselves today that BBI is a solution or not a solution for this country economically?
I mean, that's an interesting one, Joe, because given where we are as a country, this is a country with a population of about 54 million, give or take. I mean, that population is about 28.5 million of that. When you think about the fact that the average Kenyan is actually 19.7 years, this is a pretty young population. It's a very young population. And part of the reason we ended up with the 2010 constitution, as Ngala and Shiko have affirmed, is because there's too much pressure at the center. You have centralized so much of your national reality that it becomes a matter of life and death for pretty much every cluster out there, and particularly tribes. So everyone wants to have their person as the president, because that if you do not clinch the presidency, you are out in the cold as a community, as a region, as a cluster. And so having devolution there for all its shortcomings was in one way to begin to release this pressure from the center, to begin to push resources outwards, to push representation outwards, to begin to create development in spaces that had not been considered for that before. And of course, where do the young people fit into this? Is the fact that this country has a very young population, number one, but also number two, it's a very labor-intensive economy. We have a lot of, a very huge workforce, which we need to be able to absorb into the economy, basically. And devolution has achieved a part of that. Trying to push some of these resources out from the center is critical. I don't think we went the full implementation of how much we could do with this. So, for example, we give 15% to the counties. Okay. How about, pushing this figure to 35 would not have required the kind of amendments basically the two brothers were asking for, the two political brothers were asking for. And in a sense, that being just one of them, the fact that this is sort of a disguise trying to, use it to sweeten a document that, in essence, all its other classes do not represent what would have fared well for the youth, especially in terms of employment. But also, as I said, the devolution conversation needed to go beyond just having the county units and the monies that we send into those county units. How about we also devolve parastatals? What is an irrigation board doing in Upper Hill? Seriously, and we could mention many other, parastatals, government agencies, secretariats that really do not need to exist here within the center. But also, more importantly, the money that came in last year in March, by estimates, I think the president got about 340-something billion shillings. Part of the COVID recovery packages, some of the loans that were taken, grants here and there. And that's just the figures, some new figures are coming out. There's a whole bunch of finances, that need to be accounted for in terms of, the kind of deals you're getting into to get these monies. But also last year, by getting that money, by the time that some of that money begins to come in, the government owed small suppliers, I think around 136 billion, give or take. Now, a lot of this money is owed to people who, basically the small contractors to government agencies, parastatals, the national government itself, and the various other arms of, and appendages of the state. Now, considering that a lot of these people are not paid, the impact of it was very straight up on the economy. So, for example, there's a report that came out somewhere around November of last year that basically said we created a new cluster of Kenyans, about 2 million people who sunk below our definition of poverty line, which itself has a bit of problem, but for the purposes of this conversation, that means basically about 400,000 Kenyans, majority of these people being young, were sinking into poverty every month. When the president has borrowed 348 billion, which could not be clearly accounted for, or which a third of it would have been enough to clear a lot of the debt owed, especially the small monies, the monies owed to the small and medium-sized businesses. So to try and say that pushing this state funding to 35%, which is good in and of itself, that requires the kind of us to accepting the other provisions that are giving. First of all, it's a bad deal, all around bad deal. But also there are many other mechanisms and opportunities he's had to push money out of the center and into the hands of young people that he's not taken advantage of, not just in the last like a year or two, but almost pretty much throughout the last 7 years. So as I was mentioning on that report, we had, that's 2 million people. They're actually a new cluster in Kenya now known as, a young cluster now known as the newly poor. And most of it was better educated, mostly younger people, and its families, households basically. So when we come back to a space where you're saying we'll give you 35%, this 35% of course increases representation in terms of the infrastructural development that can be done on the ground, in terms of capacity building for a lot of young people, in terms of increasing basically the scope of what you can be able to do with both taxes and non-tax revenues by the state. But all around, the way it's being sold out there is not the best way to go about it. And the fact that they've had opportunities to fix this thing along the way and they've not done it, that in itself tells you you're dealing with a government that is simply trying to sweeten a bad deal. And also critically remember that that report came out in November, 2 months early in September of 2020. A new report came out that said 2.15 million young people had basically given up looking for employment, basically looking for jobs. They send their CVs, 60, 100, whatever number of organizations, and got into a space where they just say, what, I'm not doing this anymore. That's a huge number. When you have 2.15 million young people, of course, going by the constitutional Article 260 definition of young people, which is 18 to 35, who basically got into a place of despair, and they're saying, what, I'm not doing this anymore. Where are these people? What is their, the understanding of how things are working now? What is their conception of the state right now? How do they conceptualization of the state? How do they view the state right now? How do they view the idea that somebody wants to change the basic doctrine of the government to put some money into devolution, but in a way that does not even address their immediate demands, which is you need to rejig this economy to put it in a space where it's able to put more money into their hands. So overall, no, I don't think the BBI addresses that. I think in many ways, every other provisions they've tried to put out there does not necessarily have the capacity to be able to put these 2.15 million back into work and take the 2 million households, which mostly fall, as I said, young and educated, back into spaces where they're able to, either their previous level of lifestyle or even better than that. And none of the advantages that could have been, none of the opportunities that could have fixed this thing from the get-go have been taken. So as Shiko said, this has come.
Shiko, just coming to you, some of the things that Darius has mentioned, but also just the BBI report has been talking about creating, expanding the executive, and a lot of feedback that has been coming out of this is you're creating positions for the five big ethnic groups. For someone who has worked for the last almost 10 years in an organization of trying to build a society whereby the youth particularly don't associate politically, move politically based on their ethnicities, based on their tribes, but can vote based on issues. How does this what the BBI report wants to do, and some of the things that you have been doing in your institution and working with youth, what's the symbiosis, if there's any,
Joe, we've been in operation for 4 years, going to 5, not 10. Whoa.
Oh, okay.
I was a first-time voter, so you can tell. But but when you look at these things and you look at what Darius has said is very true. And there's a question that we never have a genuine conversation about, the leadership of this country. Even if we talk about the expansion of the executive, when will a Mijikenda somewhere have a seat there? Well, when will be a Teso somewhere say that one day I'm the president of this country? So we still have not addressed the issue of inclusivity. Like Ngala said, there is a way that we know how to sugarcoat these things and make them look beautiful, but then we're only creating, and it'll be as raw as it is, we are creating positions for Kikuyus, Luo, Kalenjins, Luyas, and Kambas. We are not creating positions for anyone else. And unfortunately, it's not even the 5. It's now the Kikuyus, Luos, and the Kalenjins. So we must start thinking beyond that box of this thing that there are tribes that have to get some certain positions. I was among the people who like really questioned our census outcomes when they say that Kikuyus are still the majority. And I was challenging someone and saying, with all my illiteracy, if I can think and think properly, in the Kikuyu land, people my age have 1 or 2 kids at most. Our parents have a maximum of 4 kids. When I look at other tribes, and to be specific, if I am compared to a Luya girl my age, she has 3 or 4 kids. And you're gonna sit here and still tell us that, oh, Kikuyus are still the majority. That's a lie. It's a political statement for me. So unless we start interrogating these things from a point of, are census done to manipulate elections, or are they done to actually figure this out in terms of the distribution of resources?
Right.
Even when the BBI talks about the expansion of even the counties, who benefits most? Central gets the majority of the division of these constituencies. So
Right.
what does this mean? That most of these resources will be pumped back to Central Province. Does this also raise eyebrows in terms of when will someone from the northeastern part of this country benefit from this so-called document? Because I think Northeastern would have deserved that better in terms of development and channeling more resources to it. So I just feel like everything that is being done is to create positions for 3 tribes, not even the 5. And it's not even also about tribes, it's about the people who term themselves as kingpins of these tribes. And what happens is that they have the fear, and I'm sorry to say, they're scared to lose because in a few years, they won't be alive. In 10 to 15 years, most of these people won't be breathing. So what is happening is they're trying to compete for these resources right now so that they can amass a lot of wealth for their people during this time. Because unlike their forefathers, they have not nurtured their kids to sort of come and take over. Or rather, their kids are so much disconnected with this world because they've not gone through the struggles of this country. They've known life of the Western, and I don't think they can deal with a kind of setup of the kind of life that we live. So it becomes very hard for them to say that we're going to hand over to our kids. So what do? They want to take up these spaces, make the best of it in the next 10 years, 15 years. And then by the time they're done with us, we can't breathe, we can't do anything else.
Thanks, Shiko Ngala. I mean, the BBI report talks a lot about this thing called culture and how it frames the culture conversation. Likens us back to, in a sense, how the British colonizer talked about ethnicities and tribe when they're colonizing us from 1885 to 1963. What do you make of the language that's used in the BBI report that's very, very similar, particularly as related to culture, when it talks about tribes, ethnicities, and African traditional customs, etc.?
So, like, I think we just have to say that the BBI, the entire BBI process and the 2 reports, it's a very paternalistic process. The fact that it was decided in a boardroom, and the details did not come out very clear immediately thereafter. it tells you something about the sort of political psychology of its promoters, which is why it has now gotten into problems, but also the language around their understanding of what Kenyan culture is or should be, it's actually like very misplaced. Like if you read the first BBI report, you'll think that it's declaring a war on Kenyan citizens for not being patriotic enough, for demanding rights but not really thinking about responsibilities. All this language is colonial language, and it is not surprising because the current political elite, which as Shiko elaborately explains, is on its way out, and it's really struggling to stay on course, and it's using mechanisms such as the BBI to do so. But I don't think there's a lot of options actually. But there's something I just wanted to say, that this kind of, of course the BBI was not created to support the youth. It's not. It's very obvious that I didn't even feel to mention it. But it's important to understand why. So for me, looking at Uhuru Kenyatta himself, I think Uhuru Kenyatta came to power, as they said, Kibaki came to power in a wheelchair. Uhuru came to power with a serious legitimacy question in 2013. He was actually going through a case at the International Criminal Court when he was president. Like, this is something we shouldn't forget. Like, this is a very serious, these were very serious crimes he had been charged. Even when he was president, and therefore I think, and the fact that he didn't win with a huge majority, even in 2013 and in 2017, really informs the kind of president he becomes, right? So someone was telling me that Uhuru likes to be liked also. He really likes that. And the fact that he did win with a majority in both elections, 2013 and 2017. I think in 2013 it was even a much more slim margin in 2013. And becoming president with this serious case at the International Criminal Court, I feel like he needed to justify his rule, especially the first 5 years. So much, which is why he got into problems with the opposition, and became a very, in the process, he became a very arrogant president at the first 5 years. Now with 2017 and what happens there after the elections, for me, I've always felt that he feared that on his last term in office, that he would be Kenya's president for 10 years, who was rejected by almost half of the country, right? And I think this really got to him, right? So the fact and the things that Raila was doing, after August 2017, calling for a boycott, not only of the repeat poll, but also of certain companies that were associated by the president's family. The Supreme Court, declaring, the presidential results null and void. I think all these things affected how Uhuru then began to feel about his legacy after leaving power. Now, the thing about it is, we should not think of our political elite as a very smart, network engaged in a conspiratorial sort of secret to maintain their hold on power. Because I don't know why people did not think of civic education. People did not think of. No one thought of that, right? So, like, I feel like at the beginning, because the Kenyan political elite is so used to working with old means, they actually do not know that, you know, the situation has changed. It's like they didn't pay attention to the fact that the judiciary has been transformed. It's like they didn't know that. It's like they didn't know that people could go to court and challenge that process. And we're operating in the same way that, you know, politicians would operate in the 60s and 70s. You know, this is what Kibaki was doing in 2007 with that blatant stealing of the elections. You think that you still operate in the same political environment that Kenyatta operated in the 1960s, 1970s. That things have changed. So the political elite is always doing this. A certain section of the political elite is always out of touch with how the country has progressed politically. So the BBI for me was not surprising, but also the court case challenging the BBI was also not surprising, because you're facing a political elite that its political tools are very old, and cannot deal with the current situation, the current political situation or climate we have in the country. So the language around culture, around expecting people to be responsible and not demand rights, that is a very old school language, and it didn't surprise me that this is still the thinking behind what Uhuru Kenyatta or Raila Odinga thinks is the problem with this country. It didn't surprise me. You know, their thinking is very old school, but the country has changed.
Darius, I mean, Ngala in many ways is saying that the old political guard, you know, the 60s elite, as you mentioned, is on its way out. In the interim, I don't know, perhaps if you tell us, a lot of the terrain has been captured by what you'd call anti-BBI forces, and not emanating from the progressive space, but within the political space, particularly with as you mentioned, with how dire the economy is. There are conversations around what deputy vice president is calling the hustler movement. What do you make of this movement within the current political climate of BBI and a formation of a new kind of political elite?
That would be an interesting, you know, seeing who gets to be part of, you know, the next political elite, if you will, and how power will basically reproduce itself within our generation. But also have to be cognizant of the fact that political clusters, political elites like we have right now tend to reproduce after themselves. So sometimes when we say we have more younger people at the top, they're in every way and in every bit representative, sometimes and in certain spaces and certain contexts of the what we would call, quote unquote, the old guard, you know. And so these transitions definitely is something to watch out for. We are a very young country, as I said, I mean, at 19.7 years on average, which means transitions happen very fast in a lot of other spaces. I think it would be important to have that within our politics. Not that we've fared badly before. We have one governor who got into office while he was still a youth. The numbers, I think, is almost around 60 for within the parliamentary space. That's about 130 something within the MCA level. And so, I mean, we've had youths in these spaces. These transitions are rarely neat and, you know, sort of clear cut point at, you know, a certain, you know, basically dispensation. So they happen gradually, and over time, you notice that younger people are stepping into these spaces, including the challenge that was done on this BBI document at the courts. I mean, we had Esther Ngawa, we had Ogunda, we had a whole bunch of young people who were central to, you know, the defense of the Constitution recently. So these transitions will happen. These transitions are not automatic. A different kind of young people need to step into that space. You cannot simply assume that because it's the younger people that they represent a different mindset, a different frame, a different way of looking at this thing, because the current political space have the resources to reproduce themselves in basically in younger people age mates, and sort of to keep perpetuating some of the, you know, vices or political vices that we see right now. So it is important that we are able to deliberately stay in that space, deliberately ask not just the youth question, but who really are these young people who want to be in this space, and do they represent basically different? When it comes to the hustler conversation, I mean, it was a one-time opportunity to have a sort of a ground-up, conversation around this country, considering the etymology of the word hustler itself, how it had been used up until the time it got politicized. I mean, it was a way of basically trying to describe the lifestyle of many people, how you are able to build yourself from the ground up. The fact that it was politically taken advantage of and basically, taken up by one arm of basically the current political contestation was a big loss, honestly, within the civic and national conversation for people, because I mean, you can no longer go out there and say, I'm a hustler, because it carries certain political undertones, a certain level of political baggage, if you will, because of its association with the vice president. Having said that, I think younger people have way more opportunities to, challenge a lot of what's happening right now within social media spaces, within publications, within conversations like what we are having here, and in many other spaces and forums where our peers and our age mates are having this conversation. I think it would be important for us to take stock of what we were able to do up until, let's say, 2017, and ask ourselves, can we better that going into 2022? Can we have more women in that spaces? And what are we doing upfront to ensure that that works? Are we doing that for people living with disabilities? Are we doing that for, regional, ethnic, religious minorities? Are we doing that for every other cluster of people whose voice is not at the table, so to speak? So in many ways, I think the hustler conversation was, unfortunately hijacked, but it was a critical conversation in terms of how we process our socio-political and socio-economic realities, especially in terms of how people are able to, basically earn their keep in this country. I mean, there's the old saying in Nairobi, usiulize mtu anafanya kazi gani, like akikwambia niko tu ama na hustle, like leave it at that, people somehow find how to make money within this bizarre economy that is very labor intensive without enough opportunities for young people. So within that kind of, these number of variables, the core of it would be, are we still willing to, what Kihika is doing with the team to step into that space? Are we preparing enough young people on this end such that within the next 16 months, you have more representation there, you have more voice there, you're better organized, in that space, because nobody's going to hand us anything for free. Are we better organized? Are we clear about what we want to go and do in that space, including right now challenging some of these things, like including some of the political and legislative shenanigans they're playing, BBI being the biggest of them all. So it would be important, number one, to take stock of what we've done. And I think we've done impressively, especially in 2017. And number two, are we building up towards ensuring that this transition is not automatic or a given, but it's something that will be guided towards ensuring that a new crop of people get in there who are able to articulate newer realities in that space, who are able to bring in new perspectives, who are able to challenge some of the age-old traditions that have been cemented in that space, some of which are generational blind spots of the older generations, their contributions, of course, notwithstanding. Yeah.
Great. Ngala, before I go back to Shiko, Jared has mentioned about this transition period between this old guard and I mean, we can't call it a new guard yet, but there's a contestation happening. What's the political and historical context finding where we're seeing this elite fragmentation, but I don't know, this elite contest happening today? And I think BBI is very much part of that contestation. If you may just contextualize that for us historically.
So I think that there what we need to know, and Daria says something that the transitions happen, but sometimes they're not very neat, and this is like very, very true. I think what we have now in Kenyan politics is that there's a struggle between two generations of a political elite. Yeah. So and this is informed by like Kenyan history. So Kenya like begins life as a colony, yeah, in 1920. Then the name Kenya, 1920. But then the kind of logic of governance at that time, it was that a few people had decided in the name of white settlers and of course the colonial administrators. A few people had decided that they could govern the entire territory, right? That they could control its fate, that they could decide its economic policies, everything. And this became the logic of governance in Kenya up until 1963 when we were gaining independence, right? So the cohorts that took over power from the colonialists continued that political logic. They did not know anything else, right? They did not know things like participation, broad-based mass mobilization. In fact, they demobilized the nationalist movement. You know, someone like Tom Mboya, actually, who was a very important figure in the labor union movement in the 1950s, is the one who actually kills it in the 1960s. And this is because not only institutionally, the way the state was organized, the executive was more powerful than parliament and judiciary and civil society, but also the political elite who took over the executive branch had been socialized to rule in such a way that they did not need to listen to the voices of the masses, right? That they are the ones who knew where the country needed to head. But such a political system is only possible, and you know, this I'm describing Kenyatta's rule, but that was only possible if those elites have a bit of consensus around that system, right? And to have consensus around that system is if there is enough revenue and money to wed these political elites within the system, right? So for them to legitimize the system, so if you have Rangala from the coast, you have Ngei from Ukambani, you know, you have all these political leaders who are representing their ethnic regions to legitimize Kenyatta's rule. But for Kenyatta to keep them at the center, there had to be revenue and money to basically oil that system, right? So when Moi becomes president, this no longer becomes possible, right? And therefore we witness an episode of elite fragmentation. So elites begin to, you know, Moi in the 1980s, known as the dark period in Kenyan politics, becomes very, very paranoid, especially with the 1982 coup, and therefore is basically killing off the system. And leaders who had been respected in their regions are either in exile, are detained without trial, or even end up dead. But of course, in the 1990s, that could no longer hold. So what we see in the 1990s is extreme fragmentation at the center, and violence at the local level. But what is important, and this is the point I'm trying to make here, is that during the 1990 period of informalization, right, where we are moving from a quietist economic system where a few elites are getting all the benefits of independence and others are just following. In the 1990s, it's different, because in the 1990s, informalization enters, sort of like a deregulation phase, right? And that period produces this all sorts of hustlers, right? What we call new money, right? That begins in 1990. So if you trace the economic history of individuals such as Hassan Joho, such as Sonko, such as Ruto, like if you trace the economic history, it all goes back to something that happened in the 1990s, right? And the 1990s ushers this period of the new entrepreneurial spirit, who does not necessarily need to have gone to school or anything, but they can do some deals here and there and make money, right? So it is this kind of generation that is raised by the Moi years of informality that is now clashing with the generation of the 60s and the 70s, right? And represented, of course, at the top by Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga. I mean, their fathers were the leaders of the political elite of the 60s and 70s. Right. And that elite is now fighting or competing for power with the elite that was born by the times of the 90s, and the early 2000s, these difficult periods. I really like when Darius was talking about in Nairobi now, when you ask someone what they do, it's actually sort of like a taboo question, yeah. But these times were born out, You can trace them to the 1990s. Yeah. When people are leaving universities and there are no jobs, right? The time of the expanding Juakali sector, for example. So you have all these Babuinos, you have all these characters that have now, because the new constitution has opened political spaces, that have now entered the political field. Yeah. They are now MCAs, they are now MPs, they're becoming senators, and they're becoming governors. And they want to also, unfortunately, they don't want to transform the system, but they want to be included in the system, right? So the system needs to open up. Now, what the BBI is doing is that the BBI is actually closing off the system by reconcentrating power on the presidency. And in Nairobi, you know, the president, with the latest BBI report, the second BBI report, the president gets to appoint not only a cabinet, but the prime minister and 2 deputies. The president gets to appoint the chair of what will be the National Police Council, that then ends up controlling the police. The president appoints an ombudsman who sit at the judiciary. So the BBI actually really proposes to decentralize power at the center. Yet, as our history is showing us, the more the country grows, the more people will begin to ask for power and position, right? And the BBI is going against that. And I think that is what William Ruto symbolizes now. Right? William Ruto symbolizes this when I think it was a very clever move to pick up on this name hustler, because everyone now, most people in Nairobi now describes themselves as they describe themselves as hustlers, meaning mfanya biashara, na hustle too, right? And I think like it was a very clever political move to tap into that emotion. An emotion of people feeling that a certain political elite needs to go away and we need to be in charge, not necessarily to change our political traditions or to transform the system, but to also continue what the old guard was doing, but now for more people, right? And the BBI is at the center of that struggle.
Interesting. Shiko, just to come to you. I mean, on June 1st, the president in his Madarakas Day speech said that constitutions shouldn't be yokes unto us as a people, but they need to be fluid and agile. To paraphrase him, not verbatim, meaning that we should change that. I mean, in your perspective, and he was making a case for BBI, for the BBI process and the BBI document to pass through, it being a yoke. In your perspective, how has the Constitution of Kenya really opened up the space for more players to engage with him? And what do you think BBI wants to do in this regard? Is it closing the political elite, or it's really closing up? Just to paraphrase Ngala, is it holding a yoke on the political elite?
The BBI basically is meant to come and shut most of us up and sort of strengthen the spaces for the elites. And these are like very specific people. For me, the Constitution 2010, sort of like, I think Ngala has said it very well. And you see, the challenge is when you're talking after someone's wisdom who's able to put things diplomatically, you're not able to actually articulate your own issues. But the point is, when the Constitution 2010 came to pass, the funny thing is that I was a child. I didn't know what was happening. I only knew we had bananas and oranges. That is the much I can remember. And then I remember at some point we had colors for whatever reason. But now, being that I'm benefiting from this constitution, in what way? My freedom of expression is out here. I'm able to speak. I'm able to say, you know what, this is it. Public participation, which has never been followed, which has never been implemented in any way. So we have so many documents that support this. This is one of the things I think BBI is coming to close down on. This is when the president wants everything to be up to him appointing so and so, then are we not trying to sort of close these so-called yoke in a way that it's only the political elite who are able to do some things? It's only through the president that some things are able to move. When you tell me that the president now is going to appoint the ombudsman who goes to sit in the judiciary, and then you also tell me that the president will also appoint the prime minister. At what point does the opposition of this country have a voice? At what point do we say that the president is wrong when he's wrong? And I honestly feel like BBI is meant to strengthen the dictatorship. The mild dictatorship of Uhuru is about to be strengthened by that document. And that is why he's so courageously telling you people that, oh, we don't have money for an election in 2022, but we have money for BBI in 2021, which doesn't make sense at all. That, oh, we need to move, like the IBC has the courage to come and tell us that we are not ready for an election, but how ready are they for the BBI? Why didn't they say we're not ready for a referendum at that specific point? Because it's about manipulation so that it works for the best of Uhuru and Raila. So when I look at it, I just feel like Uhuru will say anything. He does not write his speeches. He probably doesn't even know who writes them. He reads them to you. They look cute. They look beautiful, but there's nothing to it that can be implemented.
Darius, one of the key things that Katiba 2010 did was to check what people call the colonial state, and the independent constitution that was birthed post 1963 was by and large mutilated. By the time we were changed in 2010, it had been changed fundamentally 39 times. If you may, couple of things. One, because you've written about this, you've talked about this in very many spaces. What do we mean by the colonial state? And secondly, what was it about the Katiba 2010 that was meant to reform and fix this colonial state? And within that context, what does BBI take us forward in fixing the colonial state, or does it actually re-entrench back the colonial state?
Thank you, Joe. I think in many ways, the workings of the 2010 Constitution are very different from the workings of what we call the 1963 Constitution, in terms of it being a product of a very brief space within this country where the elite were able to have an honest conversation amongst themselves, and they're able to say, you know what, this centralization of power, this centralization of the Kenyan reality, this othering of people who do not fit within certain frameworks of what is considered acceptable to the central state. Basically, this new model, this new constitution essentially pushed that out. It ensured that as much power is going into the devolved counties, farming up and strengthening some of the, our institutions, and especially the judiciary, moving, of course, a lot of this power away from the hands of a few people. And that is a very fundamental, aspect of our governance system, because it creates a kind of what we call checks and balances that ensures, as the High Court affirmed, you have to do public participation, and this is entrenched in the Constitution, especially when it comes to budgetary issues. The civil education on people, and the Constitutional Assembly, of course, in as much as it has its flaws, and it's been subject to the excesses and basically bullying by the executive. It can still hold its there. I mean, we can always come back to it and reform it, and especially if we get more younger people in there who are willing to bring in new ideas on how to, basically do, the respective constitutional assemblies, of course. And in many ways, what a colonial state is basically this logic, and I think Ngala has spoken into it. It's this logic, this model of working that simply erases anyone who does not fit within the narrow confines of what it defines as, as a human being, as a Kenyan. And this happened with the land ordinance in 1902, the Kipande tax, of course, the Hart tax, and a lot of history in there. And the logic of this system essentially is that, everyone else who does not fit the narrow confines of definition of who's truly Kenyan. And this is never really on paper, but it's built into the workings of the system. You have a police system that was generally built to serve the elites, and not you. You have an education system that is built to entrench the tyranny of the 3%. That is why you look at a country like Kenya, 54 million people, 28.5 million adults, but you only have 900,000 graduates. And suddenly the Minister of Education starts clamping down on that. And, you know, because apparently we have too many graduates, because 900,000 is in the, you know, in the logic of that system or exclusionary system is too many people. And especially it's beginning to include people who, you know, from lower clusters, socioeconomically, regionally, that the system doesn't consider acceptable. And so that logic, I mean, it's built into our education system, it's built into our church system, our religious systems rather, it's built into, you know, our policing system, it's built into even how we do infrastructure development in this country, you know, and within all these basically outworkings, that system didn't change in 63. I mean, we made incremental reforms here and there, you know, hits and misses, setbacks here and there. But largely the system was able to, you know, sort of sustain its logic through successive parliament, through successive presidents, some of whom have given it varying levels of, you know, basically support and operationalization within the country. But now we come to 2010, this system that sort of in many ways pushes not enough, but a lot of power from the center relative to what we've done before. And of course, you can understand the recoil that you're seeing with the elites. I mean, it's what, again, Ngalato mentioned you know, 63 happens, you know, the Majimbo system comes in, but then within a short period of time, we realize that the colonial logic always wants to work in a way that everybody gazes at the center, and the center decides, you know, basically it's the theater of the political elite, you know, and so there's this recoil and the Majimbo system is thrown out. 2010, we basically recreated 63 in certain aspects, and barely within what? We're barely 11 years into this, we're seeing the same elite do that very gut reaction of, you know, colonial perpetrators who are basically recoiling again, because within this system, power is not supposed to be people, whether it's social power, economic power, widening the definition of who gets to be Kenyan or who is Kenyan and how this works for everyone else. And so within that understanding that this is a very, if I will, natural reaction of the elites within a system that was built to centralize everything. That once power begins to get out of that space, social power, political power, economic power, representation, voices in terms of including young people, you know, people in the northern region and every other in the coast, in, you know, in Nyanza for the longest time with the marginalization. Once we begin to bring these people, to give these people more power in terms of how shaping the fate of the country, shaping the fate of, you know, of you know, their respective regions, then the elite always react back. They want to claw back on that power. And in as much as they're promising you 35% devolution, it wouldn't mean much if the same person gets to control all these other respective seats and appoints all these other people around him, which are really supposed to be powerful positions, appointed by one person who's even now almost all powerful and is almost sort of, you know, a shield around themselves to protect themselves from the kind of accountability that, you know, redistributing power, distributing power does to basically that seat and the people around him, so to speak.
Just to reiterate what they say very, very briefly. So the 2010 Constitution was named, we said it picked on the American style presidential system, yeah? Even the way it created the Senate, you know, bicameral legislature and this presidential system. But why, you know, in a country of over 300 million people, the United States, why have the political elites there not felt that they need to increase more positions at the center? It's simply because there are so many people who are in charge of running the country, right, through the federal system. And therefore, people do not feel that they will not get a job, or their cattle will not have a place to go. Basically, do not have a market for your products because the president is not from your area, right? So in Kenya, how do you create a system where people don't have to fight because their guy did not win the election, because they feel that their life will continue the same way it used to be? If that your children will still go to school, and that there'll be books there, that there'll still be security, that your children will still be promised of a job after finishing university. If people feel that these things are not threatened, these basic life things are not threatened, I don't feel that they will need to fight for a person who's from their region to be president. And the only reason why people feel that they need to do that is because the system is so much centralized. And even when you had devolution, that was not even powerful enough, was not really what people wanted. The current administration has worked against this devolution as well. This kind of devolution that doesn't have the power. So this need, right, just to support what Dale was saying, this need to always centralize power at the center, I feel is the problem, right? And I feel that the only way we're going to have this thing we're calling inclusivity and lasting peace is if we allow many people to be control of their own fate and to be control of what we call to actually take part in governance, and not a few people in Nairobi.
Just before I go back to Shiko Ngala, I mean, in the last couple of years, I mean, from 2013 to 2017, we saw a fairly active judiciary, pushing back very many of presidential executive orders and saying that many of them were illegal. In 2017, the same judiciary annulled the presidential election. On June 2nd this year, the BBI judgment, the High Court called the BBI process constitutional, null and void. What do you make of a judiciary? What do you make of this particular judiciary within a context that the judiciary in the colony was a kangaroo court? So how do we make that transition? But more importantly is it seems in very many regards that the judiciary has become the last arbiter for Kenya's struggle. Is that a good way to go for Kenyans, whereby all our political problems we run to the judiciary?
Yes, and I think, look, like if the judiciary is doing its job, right, that's basically another way of saying that we need to be a country that follows the rule of law. Mm. That's what the judiciary protects the law and makes the law work, right? So if the judiciary is not working, then you're not a country that is based on the rule of law. That's exactly what it means. But then the question is, how did we get there? Like how do we now have a judiciary that is very independent and can make decisions that go against the wishes of the executive? This has not been our experience, right, in our history. How do you explain that? And I think I've argued elsewhere that the serious fragmentation at the center, when elites are busy fighting themselves at the center, that is when you have witnessed the most fundamental transformations in this country, actually, right? But when the elites have agreed on the rules of the game, that is when basically like the whole country is going to come under their domination, right? So it is very instructive to note that the new constitution, well, now it's no longer new, but the 2010 constitution comes into being after the post-election violence, right? So it's important to think about this kind of crisis moments and how they usher interesting developments after, right? So our first crisis point was the Mau Mau in the mid-1950s, where the colonial state could no longer hold, right? Immediately after that. The second crisis point is the post-election violence, right? Where this serious elite fragmentation that had been happening since the 1990s needed to be stopped. People needed to actually agree on the rules of the game, right? And that is basically the National Accord of 2008, which produces this new constitution. But since political trust was still very low amongst the political elite, that gave an opportunity for voices to come from outside and to make sure that the new constitution is protected, so that even when you want to amend it, the guardrails of amend the constitution are going to be so high, right? It also, this kind of lack of political trust between in the political system, where within the political elites who are busy trying to fix each other, it allowed for people in the committee of experts to create provisions within the new constitution that would then create a very dependent judiciary and also dependent constitutional commissions, right? So for the politicians at that time in 2010, it's very important to look at the political environment that produces these changes. The politicians in 2010, they were all busy thinking about who's going to become next president after Mwai Kibaki, right? And therefore, how do you use the new constitution to do that, right? So I am very sure that they did not even pay a lot of attention to the details of that new constitution, right? So long as people have agreed, as they did in Naivasha in 2009 and 2010, there was no longer points of debate that were very serious, right? I think actually the people who opposed the new constitution in 2010, in this constitution in 2010, did not even raise serious matters of the structure of government. They were talking about things like abortion and things like that. But what the political elite, which is why I'm saying that sometimes they're not very smart, is that they did not know that they were passing a constitution that would, in very few short years, go against their interests, right? And I think it is now becoming very, very apparent. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and Shiko, so therefore, Shiko, how do we start building or keep building a critical mass of youth? Because you work with youth a lot, particularly around for them to have a critical mass of people who support, endorse, and actually apply constitutionalism within the context of Katiba 2010. How do we start? Because in a sense, that there have been very many false starts, even with regards to progressive forces. Recently we were with you recently at the Sabasaba convention, and the convention, and there were very many false around how do you start to build a critical mass of people to now begin the process of implementation, but on top of that, to endorse and legitimize constitutionalism within Kenya.
So I will say we need to understand that the work of mobilizing and speaking on people's problem is not the work of the civil society, because we've made it our business. We've made it that this is our work. Our work is to speak for the people. We must stop speaking for these young people. We must allow them to speak for themselves. We must start working with them instead of working for them. Because one thing that I've learned over time and over the few years that I've been in this space is that even when we say we are organizing, we want to organize the way our forefathers organized. We are forgetting that we have sort of evolved, especially with the new technology. We have evolved in terms of how people react to problems. Like it's only in Kenya where mafuta inapanda, mtu anakuambia mimi sina gari, so ainusu. Then you forget that at the same time that fuel goes up, your unga at your kibanda will go up. So it's just that we do not have this knowledge, and this is where we need to start. We honestly need to be honest enough and tell ourselves about the actual history and the true history of this land. Because sometimes I listen to people speaking, and when Gala was talking about our history, I smile because there's one thing I keep saying. Majority of us as young people, especially the 90s, going back to 2000s, we barely know this history. We barely know what happened during those times. The history we read in school is quite corrupted, that we are meant to praise the oppressors, that we are meant to uphold the people who have been stealing from us ever since. So we must acknowledge that it's time we organize, but organize thinking that the generation we are targeting is very different. We must allow the youth to be part of these spaces that we're talking about. And we must also think about, and this is one thing, and I think, Joe, I mentioned that when we were with you just the other day, is that instead of looking at the youth who are always on their phones as quote unquote idiots, look at this as an opportunity. Look at this as a way that we can actually start mobilizing using those things. The same way if something small happens, is turned into a meme and goes viral, is the same way our revolution can go viral. If we only organize and allow these young people to be meeting them at their own problems. If you tell a young person right now about taxes and all this, they will tell you I file 0 returns. But if you start telling them from the point of why you're unemployed and why you went to school for 4 years to tarmac for the next 10 years is because this government doesn't like you and this is what is happening, then maybe we'll start changing the narrative. We must start changing the way we approach things. We must also say, if the civil society does everything, what is the role of the government? And I keep telling people, if we go to solve people's problems, then the people do not need to pay taxes to the government. We must start capacity building people to be able to understand that they deserve the best and they should demand the best because the government owes them. They do not owe the government. Literally, we give money to this government so that it can render us services, but instead we give them money to loot and they borrow on top of it. So maybe it's time we start having this genuine conversation. And as we talk of organizing, can we also be genuine with ourselves and say, let us also bring in the new brains, the new energy, and this block that we call the young people on the table. Let us stop making boardroom decisions to solve solutions in this country.
Okay. Darius, very quickly, I mean, I'd like to open this up to some questions from our viewers and audiences, but very quickly, part of negating people's humanity or a segment of society is always to freeze frame them, and the youth in this country for a long time are freeze framed, as I mentioned earlier, within two categories: either as the face of violence and these truants who go around, investing in crime and drugs and all sorts of vices, or on the other hand, there is this cluster that are helpless and need to be saved. From at a level of language, how do we begin to move this conversation, to stop seeing the youth within these two frames and see them as actual active citizens of this country who can participate in governance, not at the point of mobilizing for these big politicians, but who can actually lead, can steer progressive conversations, debates, legislation, policies for this country?
It's a well-wired system that ensures, you don't get to see them as, people who should be, in the room making those decisions. And as I said, there's much more nuance that, younger people can be able to bring into this conversation. I know we partly did that in 2018 with the Millennial Series, where we were basically saying, our story is not about IG and Java, it's about the fact that systems and processes in this country do not allow a lot of young people, and so many young people, to be able to move through these ranks and to be able to make meaningful contribution to the society. But also there are so many young people out there who are trailblazing, are doing incredible things in fantastic spaces out there. And I think it's important to tell their stories, not all of them, of course, but as I mentioned earlier, like in politics, you have a governor who basically fit the criteria of young people. His performance, of course, is something you're able to unpack and say, did he perform well, didn't he? I mean, you have about 60-something among the members of parliament, among those who vied. We have so many MCAs who fit that category, and that's just in politics. We can have the same conversation within activism spaces. One of the most important things to do to break this passivity and pathology kind of very strict frames given to the youth is to bring in nuance, is to tell the story of the diversity of pursuits, of talents, of ideas, of accomplishments that, and of interests that young people are pursuing, whether it's in politics, in law, in philosophy, in academia, in recreation, in whatever, in every space that young people are existing. So I think it's very, very important to invest in nuance in telling the story of young people, and so that you don't end up with this passivity, pathology, but also I think it's something Ngala had mentioned, that the youth are a monolithic cluster, which they are not. By being able to bring nuance into conversation about young people, you're able to break these sort of, very strict ways in which, and very convenient ways in which they try to define youths, such that, they're not allowed at the table of decision making. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Darius. I just want to quickly go to some of the questions that have been raised to the panel. The first question is by Odhiambo Omino. Thanks for joining us. This question I'll shoot to Ngala, and Odhiambo asks, what do you think of the foreign influences in processes such as BBI? And do you know of any such foreign influences that have matters on BBI?
From what we know, I mean, the answer is no, right? So like the money came from the government. In fact, the case against the BBI was raised in a sense that it was primarily a government executive project that used public funds. However, I have to say that the pressure that may have informed the coming up with the BBI or the handshake, the international community did actually have a hand in that, right? In pressuring the government to come up with a solution, especially those a few months after August 2017, when we went for the election. But I am not aware of any underhand foreign influence that has supported the BBI process, either financially or even politically. No, I'm not aware of that.
Dennis Kimathi, thanks for joining us. And he asked, and this question I'll shoot it to you, Darius. And he asked, assuming the Court of Appeal agrees with the petitioners of BBI, what are the chances of us having a referendum within the current constitutional framework?
First of all, just to respond to the question that asked Tungala, yes, there was a document that was online. Somebody was able to basically catalog the number of organizations from around the world who, in a certain way, was in support of these amendments, and not sure to what levels they are offering whatever support they are offering, but definitely once the issue was flagged, then I think a number of them publicly, stated their withdrawal, whether it was in monetary or political support or diplomatic sort of endorsement, in a sense advisory to the whole BBI basically infrastructure. Coming back to the question you had asked, one of the there's a report that came out just before we started out on the BBI conversation, and one of the biggest predictors of a civil unrest in a country is a referendum. There's an entire report and I think the entire public repository of this information that a lot of countries go to war within or 24 months before or 24 months after, actually 12 months before or 12 months after a referendum. And that is because a lot of referendums are rarely informed by a society's self-reflection and the desire to sort of move itself forward or change certain provisions. Most often, referendums are an acknowledgement of basically a split within the elites. It's usually the collapse of elite consensus that drives most referendums in a lot of countries globally, and you can pick any countries with any major sort of civil dysfunction, especially that plays out even into a war or political, sort of violence. And you can always trace there was a referendum somewhere within the 24 months of that, or within 12 months of that document. So having it now and then having an elections right up ahead in which the president and the vice president have fallen out, coupled with a referendum in itself, which is quite unpopular, and an economy that is not fully functional at this point in time, that is a recipe for trouble. All the legal frames around it notwithstanding, of course, the eventuality or the inevitability or the possibility of a referendum will be decided by, of course, the courts. But it's a very, very, risky political game to play within a nation, that you go to a referendum within a period where you also have an election that is so hotly contested. A referendum after that may be a possibility. Of course, it will still be challenged within the current provisions that have been given. As I mentioned, civic education, public participation, constitutional assembly, and the referendum itself. Yeah.
Thanks, Darius. Shiko, Dennis Kimathi asks you again, within this context of BBI, there have been also conversations that have come regarding academic qualifications for members of parliament and members of county assemblies. Dennis Kimathi asks, what do you make of this?
Wow. I think this is quite an interesting conversation. And the only question I keep asking people when they ask me that is, if we expect a secretary in a bank or in a shop or wherever this person, a receptionist for that matter, to have a certain degree, why don't we expect someone who's going to make decisions that affect your life, hold billions that you pay in form of taxes, and also budget for the well-being of your life and the services you get, go in there without a degree? Why is it that we have to be very double standards in a way that if I'm electing you into power, I'm doing you a favor, you don't need degrees, go buy yourself clothes. Yet I'm paying you, I'm facilitating all your well-being. But for you to actually get a job, you need a degree, 10 years experience and all these things. Maybe on top of a degree, we need someone with also 5 years work experience in certain places to get these positions. Because I feel like we've gotten so many people in power who have no idea of what is their role there, have no idea on even the specific seats they serve, what are the roles and what are the JDs to be precise. So we end up screwing ourselves over and over again because we rely on people who are not even open to learning. And I want to take us back to when the campaigns, of course, the campaigns are always here. But isn't it always worrying when an MCA comes and tells you, within the first 100 days of me being in that seat, I'll build schools, I'll build a hospital, I'll make roads. Isn't that a red flag? Isn't that one thing that we should be like, we cannot elect this person? That is not his mandate. He cannot. Where will he get the money from? So the fact that we never have these conversations, the fact that we have been lied to again and again, maybe having it mandatory for people to go to school, get educated, and also get some experience before vying for these seats will be like prudent for us as a country.
Interesting. Another question from the panel, Purity Mukami.
I can just chip in briefly on the conversation.
Yes, please, Darius.
On the qualifications conversation, there is a certain way in which the public space is currently disadvantaged when we go with the degree. No doubt it's a very important document for that. But I'm thinking if you're a country of 28.5 million adults, you've constrained your education system such that it's only awarded it to 900,000. There is a 2018 report, I think June, which basically says, in Kenya right now, children of the top 10 percentile are 48 times more likely to make it to university. Middle class kids are 3 times more likely to make it to university. I understand the necessity of a university degree in this dispensation and how it helps us to basically legislate and all that. But then there's this conversation to have on by having a degree, it's important in terms of how it helps with the cognitive and intellectual conversations for and then policy conversations for the legislatures and the respective political offices, but on how exclusionary also it will become for a lot of people, because it will basically say of your 28.4 million adults, 27 point something basically don't qualify for public conversations. How about if we took this provision a different way and said, there are a certain number of modules within Kenya School of Government, which as long as you have the bare minimum, which now is a Form 4 certificate, you have to take X number of modules. And that essentially ensures that, you were able to qualify as part of, basically our IEBC qualifications. That ensures you're not being highly exclusionary in a system that the education system has been very exclusionary, but also it ensures that the people don't get in there simply because, we don't want to lock people out. So can we have a third way such that, you're not locking everyone out and you're also not allowing anybody who, has barely, any bare minimum understanding of how government works getting into this position? Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Darius, for that. Shiko, another question for you from Purity Mukami. And she asks, thanks Purity for joining this webinar. She asks, how do you distribute the power away from Nairobi more, other than adding through money that goes to the counties? What are some of the things that we can do to distribute power and resources away from Nairobi? Basically, what she's talking about is how do we decentralize resources away from Nairobi and the elites who want things centralized?
I think that's quite an important question. And I think Ngala sort of expounded on this earlier on. But for me, it's about understanding that devolution was not meant for just finances. It did not just mean the 15% that goes back to the counties. This meant that even industrialization, when you talk about the parastatal, when you talk about this, but funny enough, this government of ours has been able to sort of be corny enough to devolve things that they feel like, okay, this can do, but also to retain things that give them more money. Like the youth as a block, youth is never devolved. You talk about the youth enterprise is still an issue of national government. But the question I keep asking is, if we can devolve health, why not devolve youthhood? Why not take it back to the counties for them to run their own issues with their own young people? But one thing I keep saying is that we have the 30% tenders to youth that is a scam. Maybe we need to take control of that. We have the Youth Enterprise Fund, that is also another scam. We used to also take control of that. If we are able to bring these resources back to the youth, and if we are able to build skills and create a system that works for our young people, then that will enable us to make the first step. My only fear is that where I come from, especially, we are 3 hours from Nairobi. And what happens is I graduate today and I move out tomorrow to move to Nairobi to look for opportunities. Maybe we need to also start pushing our county government to sort of start looking for investors to come and invest in our counties. Maybe that will also open up the industrial space and give us more opportunities. But as long as we still see kazi kwa vijana kama kuchimba mitaro, kuosha choo, na kufagia barabara, then we will never move.
Thanks. I'd just like to jump in there.
Sorry, Ngala, to interrupt you. As you're jumping there, there's also a question for you. You can answer both because of sake of time. So there's Martin Ngoni. He asks you specifically, and he says, going forward, what happens to the rural succession politics? And where does that leave? Where does that leave the current political players within the context of BBI? And it mentions to you particularly for them and within the context of marginalized communities. And it's someone to you, because it says you're from the coast. Where does that leave 22 politics within this current political context?
Yes. So I just wanted to add onto the previous question regarding how else to decentralize beyond money, right? I think that was the question, and I feel like this is my favorite topic actually. It was actually the subject of my master's thesis some 7 years ago, and I was looking at the costs, right? And the clamor for devolution. If you look at Bomas, if you look at the Lancaster conversations, it was not only about money. In fact, it was not about redistribution of money. It was about a distribution of power, right? So that people, if, for example, this is an example that was given that came out of Bomas. If people, for example, in a place like Tana River or Garissa, feel that they need to have control over the police, who police them in their region, they should be able to do that, right? This is the kind of power people are talking about when it comes to decentralizing power away from Nairobi. It's also power about the policy process. So yes, and I hear people always saying that, you know, health services have been devolved, like health, but I think the devolution there that has happened is you have devolved management. You've not devolved power. You've not devolved power over the policy process around health. The power still resides at Afya House, if you ask me, right? The power still resides at KEMSA, right? Like when people talk about power, it's power to decide, to make policy around an issue, right? and to have power over that, not to follow what the national government is dictating should happen across the territory. That's why we still have Irrigation House in Upper Hill, right? And this is the kind of thing that Kenyans wanted to be, to be corrected through devolution, and it really hasn't happened. The other question about where we are moving towards 2022, I feel this is more of like a political analysis question, and I'm not a political prophet, and I don't claim to be, but I feel that for places like the coast and northeastern Kenya, which for me, sadly enough, seems as if are still operating, like the politicians who are from these regions are still operating as vibaraka. I'm looking for the English word for this, as sort of followers of politicians who come mainly from upcountry Kenya, right? And this is also something that I've always kind of talked about in my work, that the politicians at the coast right now are talking about which side to pick between what is now the Tanga movement and the BBI kind of Uhuru Kenyatta Raila handshake movement, right? You do not find still a sort of regional specific conversation about where the coast should go politically and economically. We still don't have that. We have fragments of that, like the Jumuiya ya Kaunti za Pwani, but still the political process is the same. People looking to join political parties that have been conceived and formed by upcountry politicians, usually coming from a few ethnic groups, as Chiko was mentioning earlier. And this is the same for northeastern Kenya. So like this, within the context of BBI, despite devolution, people from regions that were previously marginalized or seemed to have been marginalized, are still kind of clients of politicians from Nyanza, from central Kenya, and following political formations, political movements from these regions, rather than really defining national politics. That we are still not seeing that. So maybe in very real terms, maybe you are expecting that a running mate will be chosen from some of these regions, or maybe some promises for cabinet positions from these regions. It is still the same game for me. I don't think like anything transformative has happened so far.
Thanks, Ngala. Darius, there's a question here from Murethi Monekia. Thanks for joining us this webinar. And he's wondering how do we, because his question is around how do we expand this kind of engagement within our communities, but he's focusing his question regarding the how do we restructure our public sphere, from this very colonial public sphere, so that it begins to reflect the voices and the aspirations and hopes and dreams of the people. What are some of the things we can do that moving forward? Asks Murethi Mwaniki.
Yeah, I think of course, the public sphere is always a very complex and a layered space. We all exist, we are in the city, we also out there in upcountry, and we sort of occupy different small ecosystems within the wider public sphere. I think the most important thing is to always say and realize that the centralization problem has to be, first of all, consistently tackled, that Nairobi should not be controlling 21% of basically our national economy, such that within this dispensation we are in, where because of COVID, which probably will be here for our entire lifetime, such that a simple spike means if you shut down Nairobi or you limit or minimize the business, social, and economic activities around Nairobi, you're already impacting almost 21% of the economy straight up. That's on a very unhealthy structure, so to speak. I think it's important that, and especially elites, to realize that for the proper functioning of the society, for the proper functioning of this country, for the proper functioning of its various levels and systems, it's important that no one single space or square kilometer has such a massive and outsized influence on your national reality, such that when you have to do the inevitable kind of lockdowns and curfews and all these kinds of COVID measures, that you're making such a huge hit on the overall economy. I think this conversation came up, first of all, Nairobi itself controlling 21% is a huge problem. Number two, when Eastleigh was locked down, there was a whole area of Mathare that was basically, almost starving because a lot of the laborers in Eastleigh come from there. And so when you begin to look at those kind of social settlement systems, your anthropological realities, your distribution of infrastructure, your distribution of income, wealth, and opportunity in light of something like COVID, then that should be a biggest motivator to say, move this, reorient your public system, reorient your public square in such a way that you're no longer captive to the inevitabilities, because we'll do lockdowns and shutdowns and all these things for the rest of our lives, So you almost have to budget for something like a 9-month economy in terms of time, but also you have to budget for a kind of an economy that is so redistributed, a public sphere that is so democratized that you're only able to lock down certain small systems, and if the other systems can keep functioning in such a way that the overall impact on the economy is minimized. So there's all the motivation to do it. Of course, there's both economically, there's all the motivation to do it out of the 2007 political violence and the inevitable, fears that came with the centralized system that we had then. There's all the motivation to do it because technology allows you to do it. People are producing blogs and videos and TikToks from far outside of the city. It's important that, especially for the clusters that exist within the city, to realize that the Kenyan life and the Kenyan society is not emblematic of Nairobi. Just to take one example, just briefly, the increase in gas prices. There's a whole breakdown, I think Kwame Owino did, which was basically saying gas is a very urban phenomenon in the country. But our conceptualization of it was, this is going to impact the entire nation. Of course, there's a whole conversation about how to keep, provide cheaper energy so people don't destroy forest and all that. But in a sense, you begin to see this urban-rural divide that is a very, not really urban-rural, it's a very Nairobi versus the rest of the country kind of a divide that we need to tackle right up front. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for that. I have a last question actually to Shiko from Purity Mukami. And she's asking that there are very many barriers to the youth engaging in political processes, education, economic dynamics. She asked, what are some of the things we can do? Because the conversation has always been, particularly within mainstream voices, that we need to involve the youth, but a lot of it is rhetoric. But what are those barriers that she's asking that we need to do as the youth, as the youth use that word very carefully, for enable to us to break those barriers and enter into those spaces where we can able to engage in the political processes to shift the country?
So one, I think we need to allow ourselves to start reading the Constitution. It's very unfortunate that you can be in a meeting with over 200 young people and none of them has ever seen the Constitution. It's not their fault. This document is rare. And if you're not in the circles where you are interacting with civil society, it's rare for you to find just a copy of the Constitution. So yes, we know it's online, but how many of us have the ability to read it online? Also, acknowledging that our documents use the elitist kind of English, where not a majority of us will end up understanding really much. And that's why we see, even when we have court processes and people trying to explain the Constitution, sometimes you feel like they're also contradicting themselves in this, at the same time. So I think it's up to me and you, Mukami, to just start breaking down this information to the youth in our circles. I am a believer that the each one teach one spirit works best, where if I learn something, it's my responsibility to teach the people around me. And it's also their responsibility to disseminate it to the circles beyond them. And I think we have the best platforms right now. We have TikTok, we have Instagram, the Reels and everything, and we're making very beautiful videos. So maybe it's time we start also making videos educating people about these spaces, because for us to meaningfully engage and meaningfully participate, we have to have the information and we have to have the knowledge. And unfortunately, the people we trusted in terms of coming and giving us the civic education, even of our own constitution, which is the government, failed terribly on that. So maybe it's time we just take up the mantle, educate each other, and start also using the spaces that we have. Imagine having social media, which I know, like Facebook now, I think has free Facebook or something. So why don't we use these spaces where they are cheaply available? We know a majority of our youth can access them. Why don't we use these spaces to just educate each other and see how much we can mobilize each other towards achieving a meaningful participation in political processes?
So I'd just like to give one of you, each of you, just 1 minute to just give your parting shot as regarding to the question of inclusivity. So, I mean, by and large, all of you are saying the BBI process judgment project doesn't give the youth inclusivity to political processes, to power, to resources, to economic avenues for them to fulfill their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. So then, as a parting shot, let's give each of you 1 minute. I'll start with Darius. Then, what do we need to do moving forward?
I still insist young people need to take stock of where we are at in terms of our participation in electoral processes, in political party processes, and in basically political processes, party politics and electoral process, but also to be able to say then, where do you go from here? Have you begun the process of organizing, of where to get the resources, of who's where and doing what, such that you're able to build alliances across board? That will be very critical in terms of us stepping into this space and being able to now get our seat at the table and get our voice there.
And thanks, Darius. Shiko?
So as we take stock and build alliances, I always like to say that as young people, we must acknowledge that even if you file nil returns, you still pay VAT, that is 16%. And now you'll be paying 20% for the Tala loans, I'm sure the loans that you always take. Just for us to understand that if you're sleeping hungry today, there's someone who should be held accountable. And those are the people you elected into those political seats. If you cannot afford rent, if you're not able to even get a job, if you're not even able to access education systems and health systems in Kenya, there is someone who can be held accountable. And the moment you start holding those people accountable is the moment you start taking charge of our political processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shiko. Finally, Ngala.
Yeah, I think for me, just reiterating what has already been said, I never bought the idea that the BBI actually was looking out for the youth. And again, for me, this kind of economic language, when it comes to thinking about and dealing with the youth, is old. I mean, the youth are interested in power, and I mean power with a capital P. And the youth their voice needs to inform serious political processes in the country. And I think the question should be, maybe the next discussion, how should you create that? How should you create a critical mass of young people who can then begin to really disrupt the political system in a very serious way? For me, that would be the parting shot. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, panelists, Ngala, Daria, Shiko. Thank you for those who are watching, who are streaming on YouTube and on Zoom. Thank you, our viewers. This video will be up on the Elephants and Heinrich Ball YouTube pages. So please be sure to subscribe, to follow our channels, subscribe to our Twitter, Facebook and Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe to our website, our newsletter. Again, as I said, this video will be up on our YouTube pages, both at the Elephant YouTube pages, elephant.info, and at the Heinrich Ball Foundation YouTube pages. So thank you so much, and asanteni sana for indulging us in this conversation.